Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending our program. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending our program. Fighting violence. Hello, everybody, and thank you for hello, everybody, and thank you for attending our program. Violence. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending. Starting in the last year with the COVID pandemic and attempts to scapegoat China. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending our program. But unfortunately, it has continued, or in fact, even intensified this year. And so anyway, again, I'm Masao Suzuki. I'm a member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and we're hosting this program today with a number of both veteran and new activists from literally coast to coast. So we're very excited about this. And I'd like to start off with Daisy Sim. She's from Tallahassee, Florida. And then maybe Daisy, you could say a little more about yourself and we'll launch right in.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, hello, my name is Daisy H. Sim. I'm currently working in the environmental field while organizing and protesting in my free time here in Tallahassee. After hearing about the Atlanta shooting, I decided to organize a rally in the Florida Capitol. This event occurred on March 27th with around 100 people speaking out against Asian American hate crimes. There was a lot more people than I was expecting, especially since Tallahassee's Asian population is 5%. So while organizing in a big city may come with a different logistical tactic, I could only provide information on how to mobilize a small community. So first off, no one could do this alone. So I suggest finding any local organization to help with the delegation of tasks, such as writing a media advisory, flyer creations, social media announcements, interviewing medic marshals, and providing materials such as, speakers, amps, mics, food, water, and emergency supplies. I fortunately got a lot of help from TCAT and reached out to multiple orgs, such as Dream Defenders, Asian Coalition of Tallahassee, the FSU's Filipino Student Association, and of course, Freedom Road Socialist Org. So thank you. It really helped to sharpen one's communication skills, whether it's public speaking or digital engagement, such as social media. Also a knack for graphic design, that always comes in handy. Another advice I would like to impart is to focus on your local community and the tangible ways you could better improve the lives in your neighborhood. There needs to be a point to a protest and rally that pushes beyond education and awareness. So while I did discuss Asian American history at my rally, the main goal was to introduce potential activists to local organizations who are currently doing work. The next event I'm planning is a vigil for the Atlanta shooting on next Friday, with the focus on healing and grieving for our community. So have a goal in mind when you're organizing. That aside, my goal for this panel is to convey 3 ideas. So 1, Stop Asian Hate should go beyond the violent hate crimes that we see on our timeline. We need to discuss immigration, militarization, and policing. 2, the recent hate crimes have more to do with our government's propaganda machine trying to create a xenophobic environment where they could justify going to war with China. And 3, we need to focus on creating a multiracial solidarity whose goal is to eliminate white supremacy. Asian American history is rarely taught in our school, and I hope David and Maseo will go more in depth about this. But that omission is by design. Scholars agree that one of the main reasons a full history of Asian Americans have not been incorporated into the core US history curriculum is because it doesn't portray America in a positive light. America wants to reinforce this narrative that Asian Americans, immigrants or refugees, they're fortunate to have been saved by the US. But instead, the truth is, US imperialists wage wars to take Asian wealth and resources, and that resulted in violence, and that ruptured and displaced Asian lives. So this is why we need to push the Stop Asian Hate movement beyond the recent hate crimes we see. The US military are responsible for some of the worst atrocities, like the US nuclear weapons on 2 cities full of non-combatants, the use of Agent Orange in neutral neighboring nations like Laos and Cambodia, and the US military sex trafficking and rape of comfort women. American soldiers are not only conditioned to believe Asians in their host countries are just there to serve them, they're often legally protected from jurisdictional crimes. Take, for instance, the kidnapping and gang rape of a 12-year-old by 3 US Marines in Okinawa in 1994. These crimes are, committed by US soldiers stationed in Asian countries are so typical and unpunishable that they're rarely covered in our US media cycle. So if you truly want to help Asian communities, Americas must withdraw all US military forces out of Asia. Immigration is an issue that it unites Asian Americans of all race because it's often a byproduct of US militarization of Asian countries. Deportations continue under Biden's administration today, with over 127,000 in just 2 months of his inauguration. Biden deported 33 Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees a day before the Atlanta shooting. And when addressing the increase of Asian American hate crimes, instead of defunding the police, President Joe Biden's memo cleverly disguises a call to expand more power to these agencies. That's the typical go-to method for America, to use violence against Asians to increase police funding, essentially scapegoating Asians while pushing for white agenda. In response, Asian Americans must unilaterally reject any police surveillance. Our communities are also survivors of police violence and the criminal justice system. Police killed Yang Zong, Christian Hall, Angela Quinto, Fong Lee, and Tommy Lee. TCAT is part of a national alliance against racist and political regression, whose position is for the community control of the police. This means instead of police misconduct being investigated by other police officers, we as a people get to elect who gets to look over and make those kind of determinations on police misconduct. It doesn't matter who's president. We need to consistently pressure our leaders into more inclusive policies that make coming and living here easier for us. And Asian Americans need to discuss xenophobia and its justification for, U.S. military activities abroad. The U.S. cannot be anti-China and pro-Asian Americans. America right now is doing everything they can to create a xenophobic environment to justify going to war with China, just because they have more economic power in the U.S. And we need to understand that this current wave of anti-China propaganda is not by accident, it's deliberate. Just look at what happened to South Asians post 9/11. Mainstream media spreads Islamophobia through our news. This results in thousands of hate crimes to Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus. And then, we get policies like the Patriot Act of 2001 and further military funding in the war of the Middle East. This happens time and time again, like back in the 1940s with the anti-Japanese sentiment. The biggest takeaway here is that we have to fight the current narrative that demonizes any country to justify U.S. invasion. I heard Monique will further dive into this, but now more than ever, people of color have to resist the allure of whiteness and proximity to power because the real enemy is white supremacy. And that includes a lot of non-white players. People like Sari Kim, Lauren Chen, Andrew Yang. They will peddle a model minority myth and justify xenophobia to push their own individual success at the expense of the community. So we have to reject these players and focus on cultivating a multiracial solidarity. And, now more than ever, we are witnessing an era of political shift where people are becoming more critical of policing, capitalism, and other institutional failures. I hope, we encourage y'all to further educate, organize, and mobilize now more than ever. And I hope that this panel will help you guys get the education and insight and resources you may need to do those kind of actions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. And we will have a question and answer period afterwards. And the next person I'd like to introduce is David Monkawa. He's an activist from Los Angeles, and I'll let him introduce himself further too. David.
Thank you very much, Masao. And thank you to Freedom Road Socialist Organization and my other colleagues whom I just met today, fine speakers. I wanted to first talk a little bit about organizing. When I was organizing in a a mental health institute for Asian Americans in Los Angeles. It was the only one in Los Angeles for quite some time, for many years, and it was shut down during the 80s, just as soon as the gas shock was over in the late 70s. And the people that I used to see in there were, one whole group was war brides from World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. Women outnumbered men 2 to 3, 2 to 3 in mental institutions. And these were mainly war brides who married white GIs, and they were like staged. They lived out in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, or Georgia or places like that. When at that time there was nothing Asian, no Asian anything at that time, and so they felt very alienated. And many of them were victims of domestic abuse and things of this sort. This one particular woman named Coy de Alicio was very attractive. She was only in her 20s, but she had no teeth at all because they were all knocked out by her Air Force sergeant ex-husband. And she basically shot him, and so she was released to Rest Haven. That was the name of the mental health institution where I was organizing. I guess I was what you call a SALT. That's when you don't tell people that you're organizing. You're kind of organizing undercover. And the sad part about that is that you have to go along with everything, and you have to join the management in suppressing Black folks and Native American folks and Asian folks, and suppress them in holding them down in cages and sedating them and things of this sort. Because if you blow your cover, you'll be fired. You'll be no use to anybody. But anyway, so when I was doing this, those are the kinds of women that I saw. I saw them like, I understood what imperialism meant for the first time in my life. And then I read a lot about it, but I didn't really get it. And then I saw a Japanese American guy in his early 30s at the time. And, when the War Relocation Authority engineered the resettlement program, they kicked out everybody, but they wanted everybody not to speak English, not to congregate with other Japanese, and keep your head low. Those are the three things that the War Relocation Authority really stressed to Japanese Americans. Well, this guy lived out in Colorado, and about 32, and he had this thing where if he saw chopsticks, if he saw sushi or anything remotely Japanese, he'd completely freak out, and he'd have he'd start breathing hard, jumping up and down. His eyes would all dilate and everything. It was kind of freaky, but that was a certain illness that he had because his dad had been really convinced that he didn't want to see any more Japanese after the camps. And he just kind of grew up that way and became mentally not well, obviously. So those are the kinds of places where you could really see, the impact of U.S. White supremacy and racism. The more obvious ones are people who are killed, obviously people who are killed in the camps and all that kind of stuff. People who fought back against the tear gas, they had many uprisings. So people fought with stones and sticks against machine guns and shotguns. At Manzanar and other places, people were shot in the back and killed. They never tell you any of this in history classes, but that's what happened. And that's where I really kind of start to see how damaging white supremacy is and things at an early age. I was in my 20s, I believe, at the time. And I think that I agree with all these different things that people have already said, so I'm not going to spend much time on the history of racism in America and all that kind of stuff. But in response to the anti-Asian violence that's been going on, we in the Progressive Asian Network for Action, which is an organization which I belong to in Los Angeles, we began neighborhood safety companions. And so we've been averaging maybe 40 people per week. And I was wondering if the tech person might be able to put up the two still photos that I had emailed. But what this is that it's an effort in Koreatown, and we cover probably about, I'd say, a mile square of territory. And we're there to be good witnesses and to be a deterrent. And we're also there because, if we will never provoke any type of violence, for obviously, but if we are ever provoked, we'll never fail to return a response. So that's why we're there. And we do not apprehend people. We're not there to arrest people. We're not cops in any way. Could you put up those two photos, please, if you could? And then, we're there to be helpful to essential workers as delivery people, because they're vulnerable when they're delivering, single pedestrians, storefronts, and vendors. There's a lot of vendors, taco vendors and street food vendors and things. And so we're kind of like, we become friends with them. So those are and then we hold like these political sort of raps at the end where different people can talk about, whatever demonstration they're going to. And then we also provide security. As a group, we provided security for 2 demonstrations already. And we hope to continue to do that in the future and to be a viable arm of like fighting back against cops and things when we have to do that. So that's one of the projects that concretely came out of fighting against anti-Asian violence and protecting our communities. Also, we feel that, we have to look at anti-Asian violence sort of like in the whole big picture of things and see it as a program for full equality for all of us. And I think people have mentioned things like that before, but, no China bashing. We feel that these 10 demands would really reduce anti-Asian violence. Obviously, no China bashing, Biden's anti-Asian violence initiative. It should provide money for victims and families and not more funds for local police to set up more reporting programs. How many friggin' reporting programs do you need? 100 for every city. Healthcare, 1 out of 4 Koreans and 1 out of 5 Vietnamese lack health insurance. And 3.5 people that die every hour. Most of them people of color. Every hour they die, 3.5, because they have no healthcare. We think that getting that would really help to create an image that Asian lives are valuable as well. Asians have the largest percentage of 65-year-old people. If we have Medicare for all, we have free nursing homes with bilingual, bicultural care. Housing. Most of the people who are attacking elderly Asians are unhoused people or they have mental problems. Why not spend some of that money to build mental health outreach units and additional housing right in the areas where Asian neighborhoods meet poverty-stricken areas? Those are the areas where it's happening. Why not have mental health outreach there? And there should be a moratorium on development for all communities, especially people of color communities, contracting communities. Gentrification leads to more police hostility, and more police hostility leads to more people on the streets getting pressed so that they go out and hurt other people. In terms of education, we should have every educational system, whether it's grammar school or college or whatever, they should portray the resistance of Asians, not just how Asians are oppressed, even though you ain't doing that too well either, but resistance is very, very important because that's never portrayed. They don't never want us and white folks to know that we fight back. And if you hit us, we're gonna hit you back. They don't want them to know that. It's too bad they gotta find out the hard way. Also, anything that encourages the model minority myth, that's the same as white supremacy. It should be censored out of all education. Media, no racist stereotypes. That means like model minority myth and that kind of stuff. Because media and education have the biggest impact on youth. And then finally, more stimulus. Joe, you keep signing them stimulus things. That's all you need to do. You don't need to be talking about China or nothing like that. Asian Pacific unemployment has skyrocketed during the pandemic. So we need more funds like everybody else. Immigration, don't be deporting Southeast Asians who get out of prison and crap like that, and all the other things that I think people before me mentioned. And then pay additional redress and reparations to people in the Marshall Islands and Guam and Okinawa and everybody else that you tested for nuclear bombings for 20 years. Pay them something. And finally, again, self-defense of our communities. That's where it all starts, I think. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And again, we will be taking your questions and trying to address them after we're done. Next up is Monique Sampson, and she comes here from, not Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Florida. My bad.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. My name is Monique Sampson. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. I work with the Jacksonville Community Action Committee here, as well as the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and UNF Students for a Democratic Society. So I kind of wanted to speak on the importance and the history of Black and Asian solidarity here in the United States. As organizers in the belly of the beast, it's important that we show solidarity. And oftentimes, a lot of people forget that Black and Asian solidarity spans hundreds and hundreds of years. So Black and Asian solidarity spans all the way back to the antebellum and postbellum period when Frederick Douglass spoke out against limiting Japanese and Chinese immigration to America. Mao gave a speech denouncing systemic racism in the United States. Huey P. Newton viewed Mao as a revolutionary figure, and the BPP visited China to learn more about the Chinese Communist Party. Malcolm X even speaks highly of Mao in some of his speeches, which is really awesome. Speaking of Malcolm X, very rarely do we hear people talk about his friendship with Yuri Kochiyama. Yuri Kochiyama was a human rights activist, liberationist, abolitionist that actively stood in solidarity with the Black freedom struggle here in the United States. Her and Malcolm X were very close friends and shared strategy, shared communication, so on and so forth. So in addition to Black and Asian solidarity, we have African Americans who protested against the Vietnam War. Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King, and many other individuals and Black organizations protested the evil and inhumane Vietnam War. African Americans burned their draft cards and spoke out against the Vietnam War. Most famously was Martin Luther King. Here's a direct quote from him. "I'm convinced that it is one of the most unjust wars that has ever been fought in the history of the world. Our involvement in the war in Vietnam has torn up the Geneva Accord. It has strengthened the military-industrial complex. It has strengthened the forces of reaction in our nation and has put us against the self-determination of the vast majority of the Vietnamese people and put us in a position of protecting a corrupt regime that is stacked against the poor." So those are all historical times, but let's talk about current times, things that have happened as soon as last year. So in current times, I watched thousands of people take the streets in response to killer cop Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd, kneeling on his neck, where millions across the world saw, millions in the United States saw, everybody saw what happened. I saw signs that said Filipinos for Black lives. I saw signs that said Japanese people for Black lives. I saw signs that said Asians for Black lives. Our Asian brothers and sisters stood in solidarity with us over the summer when thousands of us here in Jacksonville, Florida took the streets to demand for police accountability, to demand for community control of the police, to demand that the cops stop killing us, which is something that seems like it's a simple demand, but obviously not. So our Asian siblings stood with us in the summer, and now in the wake of rising anti-Asian violence, it is our duty and our pleasure to stand with them. It is our duty to fight alongside our Asian siblings and strive for a world free from white supremacy. We've seen the importance of Black and Asian solidarity in history, and we are going to keep seeing it. White supremacy wants us to think that we are alone. White supremacy wants us to think that we are fighting the struggle alone, that we are fighting it as individuals when we have the power of people. So cheers to Black and Asian solidarity. It's going to keep going. We're going to keep moving together. We're going to keep staying in solidarity with each other until white supremacy is uprooted from this country. So, yeah.
And thank you very much, Monique. That was a great talk and a perfect sort of entry to what I was going to talk about too, which is also a little bit on the importance of Black and Asian solidarity, but mainly from the perspective of the Asian American movement. So I think I really appreciate what Daisy said about the importance of fighting xenophobia and US war efforts, and I'll probably talk about that. And then David also talked about, the impact of US imperialism on Asians and Asian Americans, and I'll refer to that. And then of course, Monique's main theme is also very similar to what I'm going to be talking about. And so one of the things I think that it's important that many even Asian Americans are not that familiar with is that Asian America, the Asian Americans in the United States today would not be anywhere near the same if not for the struggle of Dr. King that Monique mentioned, and the civil rights movement and African Americans who fought and died for civil rights, because this basically opened the door for the 1965 Immigration Act that removed racist quotas that limited, for example, Japanese and Chinese immigration to 200 people a year. And so this really started the era of mass immigration. And just, for those of you a little familiar with the community, in 1960 and even in 1970, before the immigration had a big impact, the single largest Asian nationality was Japanese, followed by Chinese and Filipinos, and the others were very, very small, and now Japanese, not because there's fewer Japanese Americans, but we're number 5, probably in not near future, be number 6 in terms of Asian American nationalities because of the growth of other nationalities. Even the term Asian American was inspired by the Black liberation movement. Before the 1960s, the sort of unifying term, well, it wasn't really unifying, but the umbrella term for Asians in America was Oriental, of course, which is a really archaic and somewhat racist way of looking at the world, because of course Asia is only to the east from Europe, and in fact here in California it's definitely to the west. So anyway, let's not get too far into that. It was during the struggle for ethnic studies at San Francisco State University and also University of California, Berkeley, that Third World Liberation Fronts combined as coalitions of African American, Chicano and Latino, Asian American and Native American forces. And at both SF State and UC Berkeley, the Asian American Political Alliance, or APA, was formed, one of the very earliest explicitly Asian American organization. And part of the whole struggle, the struggle for ethnic studies, the struggle for Asian American political consciousness, was against this idea of the model minority myth. And this model minority myth was actually, as far as I know, started by a white sociologist, William Peterson, who argued in 1966 that Japanese Americans had overcome discrimination without protest and by hard work. And this is, of course, the main point. African Americans should follow the path of Japanese Americans and don't protest so much and just work harder. And of course, this is a very racist concept, suggesting both that Asian Americans don't struggle and fight when in fact they have had to do this in many ways through the courts, through strikes, through direct action since we began mass immigration over 150 years ago. But it's also, you know, part of the racist stereotype of African Americans. Oh, you know, they're poor because they're not working hard, when in fact they're often relegated to some of the most hardest, low-paid, difficult, and dangerous jobs. Let's see. So the problem with the model minority myth is twofold, besides it being untrue, is that one, it can feed into resentment against Asian Americans. People have this idea that Asian Americans have made it. But it also can have a bad impact on Asian Americans, because there are Asian Americans, I think Daisy mentioned, who have internalized this myth and actually think that you can get ahead in America if you just work hard, keep your head down, and most importantly, don't act like African Americans and Chicanos, don't protest, don't unite with them, don't support them in the struggle. And so this is also a very a negative thing for our communities. I just wanted to mention, and maybe Michaela, you could show the image out of very soon, or in fact, almost at the same time, Asian American Revolutionary Organization with the name Iwar-Kyun began in New York, Chinatown in 1969, and it later spread across the country, and I joined a few years later as a member. And we went through many twists and turns as an organization, uniting very importantly with other revolutionary organizations that came out of the Chicano movement, that came out of the African-American struggle. We took up, from the very beginning, we stood for socialism, but we came to learn the importance of studying Marxism, Leninism, and to have a class analysis of our community in struggle. IWK from the very beginning linked the struggle of Asian Americans here to the struggle against US imperialism in Asia. And of course, this is This is an ongoing theme, and of course, unfortunately, it's back again with the whole demonization of China and US war preparations. And this has led to explicit government attacks on Chinese American professionals. Some of the cases of Wen-Ho Lee, who was a nuclear scientist, actually from Taiwan, but they tried to accuse him of being a spy from the People's Republic of China. Captain James Yi, a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo, again accusing him of being a spy. A dismissal of Professor Sherry Chen and others who evidently sent an old college classmate in China information on how the US pays for dams. She's a hydrologist, you know. So he was like, how do you pay for dams? Because I guess in China, the national government pays for everything. We're trying to diversify. Anyway, she sent this public information and was investigated by the FBI, lost her job, and you know, in the end was not charged with anything, but she's still struggling to get her job back. Just to end, what are maybe some of the lessons? One is that as Asian Americans, we do need to unite on issues that we have in common, especially the current wave of violence against Asian, even though it's fed by anti-Chinese sentiment. Of course, if you look at the massacre in Atlanta, most of the Asian women who were killed were in fact Korean and were not Chinese. And I think this is a very important lesson. Racists don't care and don't know and or don't care what nationality you are. They don't care. One of the first victims of violent attack was actually a Burmese family in Texas at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we do need to unite, but at the same time, we need to recognize that our communities continue to be distinct. We have different cultural backgrounds, different languages, different religions, different histories. Some countries were colonized, others were not, had different colonial backgrounds. And so these help shape our conditions here in the US today. A second thing is that I think we also have to be aware that there are very wide class divisions in our community among Asian Americans. And at times of crisis, they can come together by and large. So for example, in the Wall Street Journal, there's a full page ad by all of these Asian American, you know, like CEOs and other millionaires speaking out against anti-Asian violence. This is a good thing, but in our view, for the movement to advance, for the struggle to continue, and for it not to get diverted into dead ends like having more police, et cetera, that we need Asian American workers involved in the struggle, and they need to be capable of or empowered to actually help lead this struggle. The last thing, and I think this is somewhat repeating what Monique said, but you know, I've been, sometimes you wonder, you know, there are specific victories and oftentimes there's not. But I think one of the things, you know, you might wonder about, well, what was all the struggle in the 60s and 70s about? Beyond the specific gains around voting rights and desegregation and ethnic studies. But I think there's been a lot of consciousness in the community that has become embedded and has empowered Asian Americans to speak out in when the American Muslims were under attack 20 years ago with the Patriot Act, when you know, the Trump administration had set up camps and cages on the border for Central American refugees and immigrants. Asian Americans were there to protest. And I think most recently, just last year in the massive upsurge following the killing of George Floyd, I could just see a lot of Asian Americans protesting. And this is something even 5 or 6 years ago during the first wave of the Black Lives Matter, I did not see the same amount of Asian American participation. And so this is actually very, very powerful to me. And I just want to end up with a short slogan from Chairman Mao in China. He said, dare to struggle, dare to win. From the Philippines, Maki Baka, Huwag Matakot. And of course, from Japan, Gambate. Thank you very much. I think, oh dear, I need to find, here we go. Sorry, I just, closed up our question and answer page. So let me reopen that. Okay. Well, this is like the last question in the chat, but I think it's something that different people touched upon. So the last question actually says, do you think the US is trying to go to war with China? I would like to, because any or all of us might want to address that. Why don't we start with the order of the speakers? And I'm not trying to single anybody out, but Daisy, do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, yeah. So I don't want to say like anything definitively, but I feel like, you know, the trends I've noticed, the escalation of propaganda, the dehumanization of Asian people, you know, knowing about, you know, the economic trade wars between the US and China, all indicate that maybe US does want to go to war. But, you know, I don't want to just say like yes, but I find that there's a lot of similarities between what happened to South Asians and the war in the Middle East and what's happening now.
David, do you want to answer anything?
Yeah, I think that, you know, the hostilities is being spurned by many of the CEOs in Silicon Valley, because, you know, these people feel China's an existential threat. Their 5G technology, AI and robotics is way advanced more than the US. So they feel very, very threatened by it. And they continue to donate to the Republicans and to the Democrats. So I think that's in part what's propelling this current surge of anti-Asian violence coming from the Biden administration as well as the previous one.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add either, Masao. I think Daisy and David said it perfectly.
And I'll just add one comment too, especially from the Japanese American community. Of course, we saw some of the worst impacts of what happened during World War II, where 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were rounded up and put into concentration camps. And while we did win a victory of redress, an official government apology and reparations of a monetary compensation back in the 1980s, there have been definite efforts by right-wingers to try and overturn this. I remember, 20 years ago, Islamophobes like Daniel Pipes were going around saying that, oh, we have to, get rid of this concept that the World War II concentration camps were wrong because, we might need to put Muslims in camp. And so we, just because it's been ruled wrong, it doesn't mean it can't be tried again. And so this is the extreme government reaction to possibility of a war with China. Let's see. A lot of these are, oh, well, here's something. And maybe, again, we should start with Daisy. If there isn't an Asian American centered organization in my city, what kind of organization should I join?
Hi, I could relate to this. I live in a city where there's not a lot of Asians here. But I would say like Asian American issue isn't really specific because we all have we share a same enemy, which is white supremacy. So focus on issues that you seem passionate about, whether it's environmental racism, whether it's immigration, whether it's police, and also, other than advertising, Freedom Road Socialist Org, or, more national orgs, just find a org that's near you that shares the same values and focused on mobilizing the Asian American community in that local area is my advice. So.
Here's a question. Many are sympathetic to combating anti-Asian violence, but have no problem fear-mongering the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea. How do we as socialists best demonstrate the connection between fear-mongering and hate crimes? Anyone?
That's oh no, go first.
One of the perpetrators of the crime, I think more than one actually, have mentioned Wuhan virus. I don't know what more you can get as a good evidence of how accusations of other people result in crimes, that when the perpetrator themselves repeats what Donald Trump and other people are saying. I think it's a good example.
Daisy?
Oh yeah, I was about to add, I would say ask them, like, if anyone is saying, anything negative, ask them, like, where did they get that information? I do feel like most of the time there is some bias in the source that they're getting that information from. And if you could pinpoint and say, like, oh, well, you got this from a very conservative, like news media source, or like, oh, it's written by a white China watcher who tends to, say wrong things, or like things that are that goes to our base, fear mongering. I would ask more about where they got that information, and then try to offer a different reference or source that is directly sourcing that country, whether it's North Korea, whether it's China, whether it's, so that's my advice. But honestly, when people have that mentality, it's really hard to use reason, but that's just hard.
Oh, I guess I don't have to raise my hand since I'm supposed to be moderating. But I was just going to add that, this is, there's been a long history of tensions with Asia, whether they're military or political or economic, leading to violence. I think early and, widely known example was the case of Vincent Chin, in Detroit in the 1980s. He was a young Chinese American, and he was beaten and killed by two people who were blaming him for loss of auto jobs because of Japanese auto imports. And this, of course, was misinformation in a number of ways. The main job loss in autos has always been through automation, not because of imports, but of course then again, the racists didn't know and didn't care that Vincent Chin is not Japanese. In fact, China was a country invaded and occupied by Japan, and millions of people died there. And anyway, so it doesn't. I know during World War II, I saw this poster once about how to tell a Japanese from a Chinese. You really can't do that, and that is certainly not the way to go. All right. Oh, I like this one. What are some books that we should pick, I guess we should read to learn more about systemic racism against Asians? And let me actually start with Monique, if you have a suggestion. Have you read any good books on that topic?
I haven't, but I am interested in learning more. I've only read things like, for example, had to do a paper like in my undergrad on just like historic implications of internationalism or something like that. So I basically did a paper on the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the Chinese Communist Party. So that was definitely really interesting to do, but I haven't read any actual books. So I'm definitely interested in recommendations as well.
Daisy?
Once again, I'm not, I feel like I should read more, but, and I was about to mention, a lot of like solidarity books of Asian American with Black liberation. Those are a lot of the books I read, but maybe The Making of Asian American History by Erica Lee. I like reading a lot of contemporary books like Minor Feelings of Kathy Parkham, or just, The Sympathizer with Viet. So those are some suggestions I could give, but I hope you guys have more books. I will be writing those down.
David?
Yeah, Color of Success by Ellen Wu. The best part is like when I think they explain the relationship between race baiting in 1945 and then red baiting after that, going directly from war to post-war Cold War anti-communism, and how Japanese resettlement dovetailed with the anti-Asian violence upon Chinese and Koreans when, quote unquote, China was lost, so to speak, in 1949 to, quote unquote, communism. Then Chinese became either, hey, are you an agent or are you loyal to the US? And then Koreans, same thing happened during the Korean War. But I think it's a good book that explains that particular period, which I find very few books do.
And I'm just going to add, for someone who really hasn't read anything about Asian American history, my favorite sort of introduction book is Professor Ron Takaki's Strangers from a Different Shore. It gives a really readable introduction to Asian American history, with, I should say, one major weakness is that the post-World War II section is relatively weak, especially the era between 45 and the beginnings of mass immigration in 65. But that's just something, as a sort of scholar of Asian American history, I'm getting sort of picky, but I do think for someone who's a first shot, that's a good thing. And there's actually been many books. I'm actually most familiar with Japanese American history. So I don't want to go any further because they'll start getting a little slanted towards one nationality, which is not what we're here about. All right. Let's see. Oh, well, it's interesting. There's a question of, I recently heard someone discuss the notion that use of atomic weapons against Japan as an extension of white supremacy, saying the US could justify using horrific weapons against Japan, but not majority white nations. Also reminds you of the use of Agent Orange, white phosphorus, et cetera, in US intervention in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. What do you think about this? What can we do about this within the anti-war movement as future imperialist conflicts occur? Wow. Let's see, David, I'm not sure you have some thoughts on this, but on the particular of the US bombing of Japan, do you have any thoughts on that?
It was unnecessary. Unnecessary, one of the worst racist crimes of humanity in history, I would think. The evaporation of a couple 100,000 people, men, women, and children, other than as a big show of force to the Soviet Union and as a statement against communism, that's all it was. A couple 100,000 people were sacrificed to make a political statement on part of the United States. So it's horrible. And, other than to oppose nuclear war and any other type of war, I think that's the ultimate thing.
I'd just like to add is I think there was definitely a racist aspect to that. The whole war against Japan had a racial tinge, or if not just the war, but I mean the propaganda against the war, the thinking against the war had a racist tinge. But I think David's point that it was also an opening salvo in the Cold War and a warning to the Soviet Union is it would be a mistake to think that the US is not going to bomb the shit out of you if you're white, if you oppose the interests of the United States, because the US military, and I think Britain too, engaged in firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg in Germany. And while they used conventional bombs, they basically created a firestorm almost as intense as the nuclear weapon. And so over 100,000 people died in each city. And of course, they were Germans and white. And I was just reading about how close we came to nuclear war with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So while I think it's very important to acknowledge the racist aspect, it would be a mistake to think that the government will spare you if you're white. And I know one of the things that motivated me to become active was the 1970 killing of 4 white students, white anti-war protesters at Kent State University. It made it very clear that if you're really opposed to the war, you're an enemy and we're willing to shoot you down.
I was about to answer, but so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought this was a good question because I brought up these 2 incidents. Some of the things I thought I should add, fun facts or terrible facts, actually. The atomic bombing in Japan, we have to keep in mind that during this time, Japanese colonization was taking place. So a quarter of the people who died from Hiroshima were Sinachi Koreans who were being colonized by the Japanese. So there's something sad about that too. Like we really got to see the humanizations and the real human costs of these kind of like military actions. Also, I mentioned Agent Orange. While we were going to war in Vietnam, there's other countries who were just next to them, who were still paying the price of the use of Agent Orange. I mentioned Laos and Cambodia because they were neutral. They weren't a part of this war. And I do think it's easier maybe for Americans to dehumanize Asian countries because of, racism. But I do agree ultimately with Maceo. It's something that America will do to white people. It's just, I think it's easier for people to do these atrocities when we have othered them and just dehumanize them. So that's what I just wanted to bring up. I know there's like an ending part that says, what can we do about this as imperialists, future imperialist conflicts occur? We just need to recognize the sign and be willing to fight back when we see those signs.
Okay. I think we're getting towards the end of our hour program. I just wanted to give a sort of last shot to all of our speakers. If you have last words that I should have said this when I was speaking. Anybody want to have some last words?
Last words.
David.
Yes. Could you put up those 2 photos, please? If you can. If you can't, then you can't. But anyway, what we need to do is to pursue anti-Asian violence throughout, not just the United States, but all over. Let's wipe it out in Shenzhen, China, where people are making $1.50 an hour to make that button on your Apple iPhone. And then the same guy, another guy in the UK, he's making $7,450 an hour. Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple, right? $1.50 versus $7,450 an hour. We need to wipe that out. That's Asian violence too. And that's worldwide violence happening all over. It's not just with Asians, but Starbucks doing the same thing. $2 a day, people in Puerto Rico are pick coffee beans. And the chairman is making about $9,000 an hour. So let's get rid of all that violence. That's my last words.
Hi, hopefully I could say something. My last few words, I agree with David. You got to look at the larger systemic struggles and infrastructure wrongs, injustices that's going on. That's conversations about, our military industrial complex. That's conversations about our immigration system. It's a conversation about, like capitalism and our justice system. Don't look at Asian American and the rising hate crimes just beyond like what you see on these social media apps. You really got to question like who's really benefiting from these and what can we do to fight back. And the only way we could really fight back isn't to just look at our case so individually, like, oh, this is an Asian issue, but this is an issue that's concerning a lot of people, a lot more other marginalized people as well. So please don't just look at Stop Asian Hate and be like, oh, it's hate crimes. It's violence everywhere, all over the country, all over the world.
Yeah, my last few words are going to be, I really enjoyed this program. I learned a lot. And I'm just really thankful that there are wonderful organizers like you all to take on this white supremacist country. And I think that and know that we will achieve freedom in our lifetime if we continue to work together and organize together.
And I'll add one last word. It's in the theme of solidarity. I think almost all of us are well aware that Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis cop who killed George Floyd, is on trial for murder there. And I'm sure if you have been, watching the news, you can think that, well, what else can happen but a conviction, given the prosecution's case against Chauvin. But the defense has yet to speak, and they're going to try and put George Floyd on trial, even though he's the victim. And I think it's very important. I'm also a member in favor of full disclosure of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And I know there's discussions there about we're going to be planning to hold protests on the day of the verdict, because it is not, in our view, it's not a done deal that Chauvin will face actual justice. We certainly hope so. We certainly, can't see any way out, but the fact of the matter is the legal system in this country is not set up for justice. It's set up to protect the status quo. And so I urge you to keep on the lookout for calls to protest on the day of the verdict, and so we can all get justice for George Floyd. Thank you very much.